I just started a new book this morning, and I've just started to investigate a little bit about Buddhism. And I was gifted by one of my clients a book called A Contemporary Exploration of the Buddhist Path. And I opened the book and read the first passage, and it really resonated with me, and I thought I'd read it. And it's called The Commuter's Story. When the commuter is born, he cries from the depth of his being, not knowing where or who he is. Breath is both a gift and a burden. As a baby, the commuter clamors for safety in a world in which he is utterly defenseless. His parents try to protect him as best they can, but they too struggle to deal with the anxiety, regrets, and uncertainty created by their own commutes through life. They don't tell him the whole truth about their own struggles, afraid that they might poison his chances of happiness. Childhood brings many light-hearted moments, but very few answers to the many questions that define his personal cosmos. As he moves through the world, why, a word full of wonder and terror, becomes a consistent on the young commuter's lips. Why the sun? Why the grass stains? Why does strawberry ice cream have to melt so quickly? And most important, why all the sadness that the grown-ups never really talk about? Sometimes he gets a real answer to the questions, but even those answers almost always strike him as incomplete or beside the point. Simply opening the door to new whys. In his free time, the child commuter begins to invent his own fantasies, private creations, myths to explain the universe and his place in it. He feels disempowered by an inability to reconcile his vast imagination with the confining rules of this place. He is slowly learning to inhibit. Taller, fatter people called adults make all the rules which they pass off as objectively true. They tell him that when he grows a little more, he'll begin to belong to this place, this society, this earth. If only he commutes through life a little longer, they say, everything will start to make sense to him. He will get it. He will arrive at home. He awaits high school as if it were some holy Mecca. Adolescence brings longer limbs with which to roam, but little that helps him understand how people treat themselves and each other. Nobody explains to the commuter how to just be, much less how to be with others. So he travels onwards, imprisoned in a rapidly changing body, adopting to a persona of shifting interests and preferences. He discovers only one apparent constant among the flickering of his perception, a feeling of tender awkwardness underlying all his steps. A vulnerability he may spend the rest of his life trying to pretend it does not exist. He becomes disillusioned by existing systems and hierarchies, coming to the cynical teenage view that most of the adults in his midst have as much of a clue of what's really going on as he did in the toddler that he used to be. To make matters worse, some of these clueless adults have a ridiculous amount of power over each other, tremendous control over the system that governs the world. But don't worry, he lets himself be convinced. After graduation, after he leaves his native home, the story goes, is when the real experience begins and when he gets to find his own place on this earth. He dives into post-adolescence, privileged enough to enter the invisible bubble of a university, and he watches fellow travelers move on to some of life's other institutional pit stops. In college, the other commuters he befriends nervously tell each other that when we get into the real world, that's when life really starts to get good. Even though the real world is just another name for an old reality TV show. The commuter stumbles his way into intimate relationships, but without knowing his heart, without knowing himself, it's a maddening dance to share another person's affection. He struggles to learn the unique language of someone else's mind, the floor plan of chamber inside another's heart. He feels the accumulation of deep wounds. His capacity to let himself stay open seems to weaken with each disappointment. Wandering through the emotional ups and downs, he gets insatiably lonely when single and relentlessly restless in relationships. He tells himself that eventually, if he just wanders onward a little further, he will find the right person, or at least someone to keep the bed warm. Then he will feel at home, safe, and above all, understood. But romantic disappointment turns saviors into tyrants in the blink of an eye. He decides to take a break from tyranny of intimacy, and he journeys on alone. For a while, the commuter builds his home out of a righteous independence from the bondage of human connections. Maybe liberation lies in the freedom from having to depend on anyone or anything, he decides. For a while, this spiritual libertarianism becomes his favorite place to hang his proverbial hat. He could practically write a manifesto on self-reliance. But in the end, building an off-the-grid existence with an isolated heart doesn't help if his relationship with his own mind is unsustainable. He journeys onward, pursuing a career, making his life purposeful, angling to leave a mark through his labor, his achievements. He commutes through graduate school and work life, socially networking, linking in profiles, exaggerating skills on resumes, passing out business cards, dissing bosses and coworkers behind their backs, searching for status, success, and above all, security. But what from the point of this narrative of dissatisfaction is a career anyways? It's just the many hours spent between literal commutes, a blur of moments staring at the movement of a clock, waiting to head back home that doesn't quite feel like one. The commuter finds time to travel abroad, wandering like some Xerox of a Kerouac, across the lonely planet. He decides that maybe a little spiritual odyssey will open his eyes and lend him the perfect Kodak moment to post on Instagram. On his pilgrimages, he goes to places that are sacred to someone else. He takes a brilliant picture of filtered sunsets. As the light flees from day to day, one closer to death, he accumulates passing likes from all the other commuters out in cyberspace. Who doesn't want to be the most popular wanderer? Eventually, he settles down and finds a partner with whom the miscommunication is bearable and the snuggles are sheltering, and they give birth to children, welcoming a new generation of commuters. He convinces himself that the nesting process will bring the home he and his partner were always seeking. He lets himself feel cautiously optimistic that they will erase the neurotic mistakes of their own generation, which are version 2.0 of the mistakes of the previous one. He will provide these new, improved little beings with a home and a clear path to belonging, but parenting brings a new kind of commute through upheaval and groundlessness. It turns out, of course, that everything brings groundlessness, because everything comes from groundlessness. But he just can't settle with this liberating and terrifying truth. Everything that starts will end. So he commutes onwards, idealizing the oncoming Valhalla of the middle age, the empty nest. That's when he'll really be able to get some kind of time back to himself, to finally deepen the relationship to his own being, to achieve spiritual insight, or else complete long-forgotten creative masterpieces. Or maybe he'll just get a good long nap on the couch. Finally, he decides it's when he retires, if he's lucky enough to afford retirement. That is when he'll be able to really relax, to explore spiritual pursuits easily. Then he will have the time and the space he needs to transform an entire lifetime of neurotic motion into some kind of experiential wisdom, like the carefree sages of an ancient time. He will leave behind a roadmap for future wanderers, complete with step-by-step instructions, stating exactly what they should do to find their way home. Or maybe he'll give up on the idea that life offers any lessons at all and just write a tongue-in-cheek memoir, sarcastic and witty enough to undermine anyone's need to believe deeply in anything. But after retirement, the fossil fuels of hope and fear that drove his constant commute through life continue to pollute his mind. He finds little rest. Finally, there is only one commute left, a choiceless journey into old age and death. A kind of mass transit that even the most seasoned travelers might be unprepared for. Even with all these assumptions and these generalizations of the story, how unsatisfying and isolating would such a life of lost and commuteness be? To make the story even more downer, all of the above is just the best in case, most privileged scenario for a life spent in an choreless commute. The above is a life defined by what friends of mine have called the first world problems. Many of us don't even have the option of wandering all the way into an unsatisfying old age. Sickness, accidents, and violence can cut this short story before its climax. And the great majority of humans on this planet not only face these existential dilemmas, but they're also oppressed by the external forces of systematic poverty and bias produced by the greed, intolerance, and delusion that have gone viral across the globe. The commuter's narrative is a tale of resentment, grasping, and isolating fear, a story with which most people I've met are familiar. So I read that this morning, and I'm someone who's really identified for most of my life with like the positive of everything, and lately I've been really just like feeling a lot more like this dilemma. So it's really ironic picking up this book out of nowhere. I just picked it up off my bookshelf. I've had it for a while, and reading that, and it just resonated, and it's like I thought I'd read it. So luckily there is good news. So the good news: our lives and society certainly generate a lot of bad news for anyone brave enough to pay attention. It's a mark of great maturity to realize that we can't become properly optimistic about life, and we can't take responsibility for the state of the world until we're willing to very honestly face the confused side of our situation. This honesty is where the road home has to begin. The historical Buddha first taught about the truth of dissatisfaction that comes from not knowing how to deal with our own mind, to a group of intensely depressed spiritual seekers who were literally torturing themselves in pursuit of happiness. Given this context, I've always thought that the Buddha's description of our dissatisfaction with the commuter through life was simply meant to create a moment of honesty and relief in which the student could admit that they were having a hard time. This is my favorite phrasing of the first noble truth. So in Buddhism, there's Four Noble Truths, which is the foundation and basis of the path to liberation. And the first noble truth is, it's always okay to admit that you're struggling, and that struggle is the truth of experience. Why are we struggling so much? To reinterpret the second noble truth in the language of home, people struggle because we don't know where we belong, and we always assume that home lies somewhere other than here and now, a mistake that sets us on an exhausting commute. The first noble truth, the simple acknowledgement of our struggle, is actually the good news. If we start any journey with the rose-colored glasses of false promises, we end up disillusioned. If we start with an acknowledgement of reality, free from shame or embarrassment, connecting our own struggle with the struggle of others, then we can move toward a genuine optimism. The good news about being human is this: the commuter's story is based on a mistake, a fully workable mistake, which is the third noble truth. Our life is never told in just one story or in one storyline. If the commuter should ever find a way to feel at home, the whole vantage point of life changes. If we change the lens through which we view our experience, then the narrative always shifts as well. Cynicism can quickly become optimism if we find a road home, a path outlined in the fourth noble truth, and the commuting zombie eventually turns back to an empowered human being. All of us have at least glimpsed another way of moving through life, an alternative narrative that arises in parallel to the story of alienation. Sometimes, even just for a moment, something in us shifts, and we don't fix it in whatever will happen at the end of this particular transition. For a moment, we actually arrive in the present, feeling safe and belonging right here. A whole new realm of possibility emerges when it feels like we actually belong in the present moment, in the present experience. We start to appreciate life in a way that is impossible to express verbally. It's nothing magical unless you consider experience itself to be magic. It's just the feeling of reality shining through the gauzy filters of hopeful daydreaming and fearful nightmares. If we can learn to consciously reproduce the feeling of returning home to the present moment, we start developing confidence that we belong here. Maybe we belong here even as much as the great saints and sages of human history, the enlightened people who actually figured something out about life. If we feel like we belong here enough, we experience the great relaxation that comes with not competing against idealized images of a different, better me, ideals that by definition we could never live up to. Shame and guilt about who we are slowly subside, momentarily liberated from deeply ingrained forces of self-punishment. We start to take responsibility for what happens to us. We smile and recognize our own mental agency. Then we open our eyes and start looking other people in the eye, listening to their stories more deeply. True friendship and intimacy take shape only when we are present enough to experience more than just one narrative, as well as to participate in our shared human experience. Suddenly inspired and naturally energized, we can even begin to take responsibility for belonging to the planet Earth, for feeling at home in relation to all the planet's commuting inhabitants. In this alternate story, we experience our experience of time itself ceases to be one of cyclical entrapment and deja vu pain of just going through the motions. Life is no longer just about trudging onwards towards oblivion. In the alternate empowered narrative, the passage of time starts to represent spontaneous opportunity. Every day is new, every moment fresh, every relationship sacred. In this story, no one is ever doomed. Now is always the moment of creative potential. Now is always the moment of creative potential. I just thought I'd repeat that. In this alternate story, we are awake. So that's what I read this morning, and I wanted to share it. And it's funny, just like thinking about like the Four Noble Truths, and just, I think for me specifically, just the acknowledgement that there is struggle and suffering is something I don't feel like I've often acknowledged in life, and I feel like I'm starting to more, is to really put attention on that, to understand it deeper, and to be honest about that as a truth of of existing. It's funny because in Buddhism they say that the purpose for suffering is ultimately existence itself, is that we look for safety and we try and attach to something so we can feel that safety and that sense of home and belonging. But the dilemma is that the nature of reality is moving and changing, and the fundamental law of the universe is change. So that becomes the dilemma. We're trying to attach onto a moving moment, and fundamentally it's not possible. So that becomes a source of dissatisfaction, as you're never quite settled. Anyway, just wanted to share that. This book is called, that was the first 6 pages or whatever. It's called The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist Path.